Hello again, everybody, and welcome to our next module here. In this module, we're looking at chapter 8 in our book and looking at really the issue of sin. And a number of you had pointed out earlier in the class and earlier in the book that Waddell doesn't seem to talk about sin much, seem to have a very sort of optimistic take on human nature and the possibility of moral living. And I think that's a fair assessment. He certainly is coming at it with a generally positive take on things, but he does spend an entire chapter here focusing on the effects of sin and how sin is really pervasive and undermines everyone's ability to actually live out natural law and morality. So I think obviously that's an important piece to presenting this overall depiction of Catholic morality that he's looking to provide for us. And I really do think, in general, I think he does a nice job in the chapter of addressing sort of the different aspects of sin, right? So, first of all, I think this is one of the real benefits of natural law in terms of how we as Catholics kind of establish our moral principles, moral rules, moral teaching, right? Because there can be a tendency in a lot of Christian tradition, and certainly also in a lot of Catholic discussions, right, to treat sin primarily as the breaking of some sort of divine list of rules up in heaven, right? And so that sin is seen primarily in terms of, oh, you broke this rule, and therefore this punishment is applied to you. Um, and it can seem kind of arbitrary in sort of a divine command theory sort of way. Like, um, just because we're supposed to be creatures and not get too uppity, God has made a list of things we're not supposed to do. So when you sin, you're breaking one of those rules, which is really a rebellion against God, and then God is going to kind of punish you by kind of throwing you in jail or the eternal equivalent of that in hell or possibly temporarily in purgatory, and that's going to be your punishment for breaking this rule. Um, and obviously, there are aspects to that that are important parts of Catholic theology, important parts of how we understand spiritual life. But that way of talking about sin, about talking about immoral actions or vices, can be very remote for many people in today's world, and it can also seem very arbitrary, right? That why is it that God is punishing people for breaking rules on this list, right? And what the natural law approach allows us to do is to reflect on and kind of concentrate on how um, when we do something immoral, it is not just breaking an arbitrary rule, right? It is acting contrary to our true nature, and that the consequences that often follow from those sorts of acts are not necessarily or not primarily because God is kind of smiting us or punishing us. Bad things happen when we act immorally because we are acting against our nature. And when you act against your nature, that harms you, that sets back your flourishing, right? So it's not an arbitrary punishment for an arbitrary rule. It is a sort of natural consequence for going against the proper way that a human being is supposed to live. And I think there is a lot of potential for having more productive conversations in our society about right and wrong um, in those terms, as opposed to, instilling fear of some divine thunderbolts or retribution from on high, which is very foreign to many people or can stir up a lot of other sort of emotional reactions against that idea. So I think that is worth highlighting. It's certainly kind of the general approach that Waddell takes to the topic. But he does do a nice job of kind of going over sort of the different aspects or types of sin, right? So that, um, as we've already talked about a little bit uh, with sort of corporate sin, right? When we talk about principle of legitimate cooperation, for example, right? That many of the activities that we are part of in the modern world, we do as part of these large organizations, right? And when those organizations act wrongly, you can get these systemic sins, right? You get injustices that are sort of built into the machinery of corporations or governments or society, and that can be kind of one of the major types of sin, major types of forces working against true human flourishing can be these systemic sins. And those can, of course, be really difficult to address. Um, and more complicated than, individual actions. Should I steal a candy bar or not? Is pretty straightforward in most cases. Is it immoral to make candy bars and to advertise relentlessly to get children to eat as many candy bars as possible? Um, that's a more complicated topic, and it also has some pretty profound impacts on our larger society. So those are the kinds of things that we also have to wrestle with when we're dealing with moral living and moral norms. Is how do we address behavior on the large systemic level? And I do think it's also worth noting, right, that Waddell addresses the idea of original sin in here as well, right? That human beings do seem to be born with this tendency to act in ways that are contrary to our true good. And that's just something we have to recognize about what we would traditionally call our fallen human nature, right? Is that we have this self destructive tendency within us that all of us struggle against, both on an individual level and as a society. And I think one of the things he talks about and explains pretty well that's worth another mention, right, is the challenge of kind of figuring out exactly how and why this happens. Why is it that people act contrary to their good, right? Because we've said before that all people are seeking happiness, um, and this is obviously true on one level, right? We seek happiness, and yet we act in these ways that make us unhappy. And how does that happen? Um, as he explains, a lot of times this happens because of a false understanding or a false view of what will make us happy. Um, but again, he points out it's not necessarily as simple as, oh, we were deceived or we misperceived things. There does seem to be a willful misunderstanding that happens in many cases, right? That we kind of decide that we're going to pursue something even though we know it's a lesser good. We convince ourselves that it is, in fact, the proper good. Um, and then one of the real challenges in theology is figuring out how sin happens, right? If we go with the standard story of Adam and Eve as these perfect, as a perfect man and woman, not corrupted in any way by sin, why would they ever initially choose wrongly, right? They have a perfect intellect that tells them what is good and what is bad, and they have a perfect will that is always going to choose the good and reject the bad. So how is it that sin enters into that system? And that is a really complicated issue to try to sort out. Um, and in a similar way, we still wrestle with this today, right? That as St. Paul very famously asks, why is it that I don't do the things I know I want to do or should do, and vice versa, I do the things I know I shouldn't? That we have this conflict within us. Um, the short answer is Waddell doesn't know exactly why. I don't know exactly why. I don't think any of us know exactly why. But it is an aspect of human moral life that we have to be aware of, and then we have to take as many steps as we can to kind of move in the right direction, right? And to break out of that cycle as much as possible. And we do that by growing in virtue. And of course, in this chapter, he's also talks about how we can actually make things worse if we move the other direction and if we grow in vice. Um, and he explains how that can happen both on an individual level, right, by developing these sinful habits, which then become second nature to us. But it can also happen again on that societal level, right? And this is where he brings in the discussion of racism at the end of the chapter, right, where um, a bunch of individuals can act in sinful, racist ways. But then that is not going to be limited to just themselves, right? That they create an atmosphere, a community that holds these values. Those values are then perpetuated and passed on to the new people who enter that community, the children, and you get built into different cultures, different societies, these sorts of systemic sins, right? As, for example, racism, right? And one of the challenges here, obviously talking about this in 2025, is complicated, right? There's a lot of political angst and debate around how we deal with issues like racism, and a lot of disagreement. But I do think on one basic level, we have to recognize that racism is a real problem, and that it is a very pervasive problem throughout our nation's history, and I would say up into the current day. And again, lots of debate, but kind of one of the things, um, I don't know, you probably all have this experience of how different parts of your life at a certain time will kind of fit together in ways that you didn't really anticipate. And I recently have been listening on Audible. We have a family kind of subscription to Audible, so we get these books. And so I picked or not an autobiography, one of a biography of Frederick Douglass, the very famous African American anti-slavery advocate, and then a very important public figure in advancing the fight against racism after the abolition of slavery. And if you've never read any Frederick Douglass, I highly recommend him. I think he is clearly one of the greatest orators, authors in English speaking history, right? He has a particular speech called What to the Slave is the Fourth of July that I think is kind of one of the most powerful pieces of rhetoric ever produced in English. So if you've never read it, I would highly encourage you to take a look at that. But obviously, in listening to this biography, it is striking, sort of just the intensity and widespread nature of racism in American history, particularly around the period leading up to the Civil War and afterwards. Um, but it is, to Waddell's point, I think it's very easy for us to point to others and say, oh, well, yes, those people have this, and but I think it is often much more pervasive than we really recognize on sort of any conscious level, right? And one of the striking things, again, about that history, that biography, right, is being struck by how racist the good guys are, right? So the good guys, obviously, like Abraham Lincoln and other figures who opposed the Confederacy and slavery, when they turned around to actually address the status of blacks or African Americans in society, they said outrageously racist things and treated them in obviously racist ways. Um, and so it is sobering to see the good guys, right? It's very easy for us to compartmentalize and be like, oh, the South, the Confederates, they were bad and racist, and then we had the good guys who won, and racism lost. Well, the good guys who won, while obviously it's good to oppose slavery, also were very racist, and did not, in fact, want to bring about the real equality of blacks and whites within the country, which is, I think, a difficult thing to wrestle with in looking at our history. My family also recently took, last year, we like to take little road trips. We didn't have a lot of time, so we said, oh, let's go to Arkansas. We've never been there before. So we went to Little Rock, and there were lots of really interesting things, some really cool restaurants, a lot of cool stuff. But one of the things that's in Arkansas is the school where desegregation was enforced by federal troops. Um, and so if you go visit that museum, go to the historical site right across from the school that is still a functioning school, it is really striking. And if you look at some of the behavior of the citizens of Little Rock, and the banners they held up and the things they did and shouted at these poor children who were trying to go to school, it is appalling. And what's really striking is to reflect on the fact that some of the people in those images are still alive today, right? So some of the younger children from Little Rock back when this desegregation happened are still in Little Rock, are still there. And we are not that far away from those behaviors. And I think it would be crazy to claim that those ideas and attitudes have been completely eliminated from our culture, um, even if we want to say that we have made real progress. So I do think, as in everything, I think nowadays it is difficult to deal with this outside of kind of our current political turmoil. But I would ask you to do that and really reflect on that topic. And I think Waddell does a good job presenting the bishop's take on it, and also leading us to reflect on how um, sin really is pervasive in many ways, both in our own wounded nature, it's in our individual sinful choices and actions, but it is also a part of even our own community, our own cultures, behaviors, and a whole host of areas. Um, we see sin being a part of that. And so obviously that then means we should work to minimize and move away from that sin as much as possible, both on an individual and a collective basis. So those are just some things I wanted to emphasize from the chapter, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and reactions to it as well. Thanks very much.